Good afternoon, and welcome to the 2018 Sloan Sports Analytics Conference. My name is Megan McClenahan. I'm a first-year MBA MS Engineering student here at MIT Sloan, and it is my pleasure to introduce to you the panel of Is AI the Answer? Our panelists will be, starting closest to me, Martin Reeves, Director of the BCG Think Tank on Strategy, Patrick Lucy, Director of Sports Science at Stats, Sam Hinkie, former President and General Manager of the Philadelphia 76ers.
What a world. You've got fans.
Sam, you brought some guests.
Ben Alamar, Director of Analytics at ESPN. And our moderator will be Paul Michelman.
My team's not here, apparently.
Our moderator will be Paul Michelman, Editor-in-Chief of the Sloan Management Review. The panel will be 40 minutes in length, and there will be 5 minutes at the end for Q&A. If you have any questions during this time that you'd like to ask the panel, please tweet them using the hashtag #AIAnswer. With that, I'll hand it over to Paul.
Megan, thank you very much, and thank you all for joining us today. You know, a couple of years ago, we weren't talking about AI very much, and if we were, it was in very speculative terms. A year ago, the buzz started to build, and today that buzz has turned into a cacophony. I'm already worried about what language I'm going to use to describe the sound of the conversation next year. It's hard to imagine a conversation about technology or about strategy where AI isn't in that conversation, if not dominating it. What's your AI strategy? What are you guys doing with AI? And from where I sit, that hype is warranted. When you think about the potential of AI to transform the way we live, the way we work, the way we manage our organizations, it feels as limited as our imaginations will allow. There's this one problem. I'm not sure we know what we talk about when we're talking about AI. I don't think we share a common definition of what it is. In fact, I think if someone in the back of the room, and you don't actually have to do this, walked into the hallway and asked a dozen people to define AI, 6 would run away scared, and the other 6 would come up with 6 different definitions. And I think that's a problem. It's a problem when you're talking about something as transformative as AI. It's really a problem when you're trying to moderate a panel about AI. So before we dig into the meat of the matter, I'm going to ask Patrick Lucy, he knows he was going to be put on the spot, to give us a working definition, at least for the next 40 minutes in this room, of what we're talking about when we talk about AI.
Yeah, so it's tricky. So I apologise, I'm not drunk, guys. I'm actually Australian, so just bear with me.
That's the same thing, isn't it?
Who said that? So the way I like to think about it, and it's tricky because, you know, a lot of people have different definitions. The way I like to think about it is that it's just technology that emulates humans at a particular task. That's actually weak AI, but that's the things that we touch every day. Okay, so Alexa, you know, Google Home, Siri, you know, they're examples of you know, AI in the wild. But the things we're talking about the last couple of days is you know, the advanced metrics that we use. So expected point value in basketball, it could just be detecting pick and rolls. Soccer could be detecting expected goal value. We actually have some papers here on actually simulating fine-grained behavior. So they're all examples of AI, but just emulating a human at a specific task, you know, I think is a reasonable start.
All right, thanks a lot, Patrick. And I think you've given us an important building block for the conversation. And now I'm going to ask Martin to add a second, I think, really important foundational component. Martin doesn't work in sports, but the work that Martin does leading the Henderson Institute at BCG has given him a broad perspective on what's going on with AI in organizations across the world outside of sports. And Martin, I want to just take a couple of minutes, talk about some of the research, some of which we have done, actually, our organizations in collaboration, and kind of lay the stage for what AI adoption looks like today broadly.
Well, we hear a lot about the leading edge of AI, so we may have the impression that AI has already eaten the world. So we were quite interested, we teamed up with Paul's team to look at the actual state of AI across 3,000 companies in 20 or so nations. And a couple of interesting patterns emerged. So indeed, expectations are extremely high. 85% of companies actually believe that they will be competitively advantaged through AI within the next 5 years. On the other hand, only 5% of them are actually intensively using AI in the mainstream of their business. So there's this enormous gap between expectations and current reality. So I think we can probably be reasonably certain that there are transformative applications in business and sports. I think it's precisely at that point in the hype cycle where it's impossible to say what they will be and with what timing. But what we can say is that there's enormous dispersion across companies in those that have engaged, that are actually very au fait with all of the barriers and technicalities and are hiring the talent and are experimenting learning, and those that are virtually doing nothing. I'll just wrap up with one example. If you look at the insurance industry, for example, there are companies out there that have hundreds of working applications, customer-facing applications, and there are others of similar size and resources that have none at all. They're just talking about it. So really, the learning curve of AI has already begun in earnest, I think.
All right, great. Thanks, Martin. I think we'll kind of come back to you from time to time during this conversation where you can kind of reflect off of what you're hearing from our sports industry panelists. But let's turn the conversation to sports now. And for this part of the conversation, let's think about a 2x2 matrix. So all you B-school majors B-school students should be comfortable in the audience. You too, Martin. One axis is temporal, so short-term and long-term, and the other axis is performance on the field and off the field. And I'd like to kind of go down the line of our sports industry folks and talk about those four quadrants. And maybe we'll do them two at a time. So we'll start talking about the short term on and off the field. Ben, you want to kick us off?
So, I mean, short term, and it depends sort of what the level of cutoff you think of is AI. Things are happening already. Like, we're already doing deep learning on things. We're already, using spatial data to identify very granular, pick and rolls, who's guarding who, where the ball is hitting the rim, and what that means and how you adjust and make decisions. We're starting to optimize lineups, all these kinds of stuff. And long term, though, I think you have, as you say, it's capped only by our imaginations. I mean, I can, someday I want to download Sam's brain and download Daryl's brain, have a simulator for future GMs so they can work on trades with all the best GMs that have been around. Have download quarterback's brain so we can understand decision making on the field. All that kind of stuff is stuff, ideas. We've started. We'll get there eventually, but it really is sky's the limit at this point.
Well, in the short term, what are some things that you're doing right now at ESPN?
So we're working right now with spatial data to understand shot quality on the NBA. So when you see a shot, we all know 2s versus 3s. So that's been around for a while. But now it's not just 2s versus 3s. What kind of shot was it? Did you create the shot yourself? Did you roll 5 times before, or were in catch and shoot and you had the ball right there and you're in this perfect spot to take off? And where was the defender? Was he moving towards you? Was he standing still? Were you wide open? All these kinds of pattern recognition stuff that we can pull out and understand how good different kinds of shots are. So it's not just 2s or corner 3s. It's how good is a wide open long 2 better than a contested long 3? We can get into those answers now.
And so I just want to keep you on the spot for just a second. I think one of the things that a lot of us struggle with when we're thinking about AI, and in many respects, it feels like it's just an extension of analytics. It's just an extension of algorithms. How is what you're talking about here different from what you would have been doing a year or two ago?
I think it's deeper and more complex. It's straightforward linear regression versus something where we have to actually train a model to understand something deeper than what is on the very surface of the data.
Great. Sam?
I would build on that last part. I think in some ways it is just a progression of going from basic data collection to increasing uses of regression and more complicated versions of regression to a place where you have sort of fewer and fewer humans involved in those decisions. You're not selecting the variables, but instead the machines are selecting the variables for you. The trade-off there is the same trade-off we've been balancing the whole time, which is you understand less and less about what's happening because it seems to be more and more of a superpower that no one can understand. That's how many people right now look at basic regression, right? That seems novel to a whole bunch of folks that there's 4 or 5 variables and that will spit out a prediction of what will happen and that you think that prediction works this well. This is just that to the extreme. But increasingly, like, this is where we're going. This happens all the time, and we take these things for granted in our daily lives and in our roles in whatever organization you are. That there's a decision support system behind it that is often surely you can't describe, and often many people in your organization can't describe. But over time, you get increasingly comfortable with the predictive value of this. And at the end of the day, that's what you really care about, is how to find the highest predictive value. So
do you want to take a minute and talk about the work you're doing right now?
So, I mean, I teach at Stanford. It's a couple days a week. We don't deal with that very much at all. We're talking about negotiations and things and just sports in general.
Yeah.
But what I do a little bit on the side is some investing in this space, and a lot of the startups in this space. It's just such an interesting time because in the same way that if you feel like the world has changed a lot in the last 24 months, just wait. Like the pace in which the research is coming out of often the sort of the big tech companies and Facebook and DeepMind and the like, but even out of other places in an open source way, like the things that we're able to do. I was having a conversation yesterday with an old colleague about a Facebook put out a new paper just recently where you can take a two-dimensional camera, just a normal camera, and get all sorts of interesting three-dimensional renderings. That becomes transformational when it can scale. Like the ability to be able to take a corpus of data and apply an algorithm like this to it and create the data stream out of it is what really makes it powerful.
Is there anything you're seeing today, either in practice or close enough on the horizon, that you think, man, I wish I had that available to me when I was running the franchise?
Oh, for sure. And vice versa as well. Like there's some things we had that I wish I had access to now that would be helpful. I would say even now, like I will turn on an NBA game and on the West Coast maybe catch the second half of a game, and then you'll realize there's 10 other games and you're not going to watch them all that night. But there are like a surprising number of YouTube channels, some of which are human-driven, many of which are increasingly algorithmically driven, that splice a video up in lots of different ways, right? And you lose lots of context, so it's not as good. You'd be much better off spending 30 hours watching 10 games. But if you don't have that 30 hours to spend, it's not bad to watch the other 9 games like this in 6-minute chunks or 10-minute chunks or 20-minute chunks. And often these things are largely just algorithmically edited.
And at a certain point, the algorithms are going to understand that you actually have 5 minutes to watch the game, and I have 7 minutes to watch the game,
Right.
and I like to see a lot of the defensive part of the game, and you like to see the slam dunks, and we're going to you'll get served with that kind of content in the way you want it, as opposed to what some algorithm pre-programmed to deliver.
I mean, in general, right now, the reason YouTube is addictive for a lot of people is the algorithms are great. And so once you watch it, the next thing it renders for you is increasingly more and more and more interesting. And the list is a teaser that works better and better and better the more you use the product. These are the same kind of algorithms that drive everything in our lives.
And what I hear Ben saying, no, actually.
Yeah, no, I was just going to chime in there, Sam. So they're going to get better, as you alluded before, because my big thing is knowing what data can do and what it can't do. So a lot of data that we have, some at Stats, we've had 36 years worth of data, got a lot of tracking data, but it's a reconstruction of the game. Okay, so if I'm just looking at dots floating around, there's a lot of context that I'm missing. And you mentioned before, like body pose, so we're doing stuff from broadcast, tracking body pose in real time. And so from that, we have a better reconstruction of the match, and so we can highlight specific things that you want, Ben, or what you want, Sam. So we're just scratching the surface. Yeah. So there's so much more data to be had. We just need to digitize it and just unveil those algorithms. Yeah.
So Martin, how does this resonate with you?
So I think in the businesses we looked at it, I think we're very much in an early game. And in the early game, certain things are important and different things can be important later. So right now, I think, talent, education of senior leadership, first applications, where to apply it, the efficiency of individual steps, these sort of things are important. But I think where it's going in business is intelligent whole organizations, and not just doing one step more effectively, but actually having organizational learning. I think it's about changing the allocation of the value pools in industries. So if you do certain things better, it not only is more efficient, it potentially attracts profit from one place to another. And also the biggie, I think, one thing that's probably the biggest misunderstanding in business is the difference between efficiency that's available to all and competitive advantage. If we've all got access to the same algorithms, and many of the algorithms in this space, think right in saying a public domain, then there is no advantage in that. We'll all be more effective, but equally so. The advantage, I think, is ultimately in things like the data, the human-machine interface, the first mover effect. Where are you on the learning curve and so on. That's where we will be going, I think, next.
So on that, let's stay on that the question of commoditization, because Ben, you and I were talking about this a little bit the other night when you were talking about some of the things that you're doing with the analytics team at ESPN, and I asked that question, is there a risk that some of these things will become commoditized, that you're going to invent something that other people will then come and take advantage of? What do you think?
I hope so at ESPN. I mean, that's our goal, is to create metrics that everybody uses and help inform them. Because if they're, our goal at ESPN is to tell stories and entertain fans. And if we've done our job right, then everybody should be using those things and learning more and enjoying the games more. So I hope people start to think of as QBR as how we understand quarterback play. That would be great.
Great. So Patrick, one of the things that I believe you brought up in a chat we had before this was gambling, right? And the potential impacts of AI on the gambling industry, particularly with respect to the ability to run simulations and scenarios. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so when we talk about AI, we have to think about how we evaluate it. The information that we have, how good's our algorithm? Prediction is that task. So if we need to predict and we have the value, we have to show how good our algorithm is. We have the odds. That's essentially our benchmark to show that we can actually do on par as good as a human, or if we can do better. So I'm not big into gambling, but I do believe that's just the benchmark that we have to aim towards. So when you're evaluating algorithms, or if you're evaluating the quality of your data, that's one way of measuring those types of things. And that's another information source too, So if you think about gambling, that's a predictive market. So in terms of machine learning, basketball games being played, you have 1 million people betting on it. That's 1 million classifiers. They have all this information. That's so much information, and we're projecting that to one dimension, which is interpretable. So whether we have the data that we capture or this data generated by humans, that's all information. So we can compare against it, or we can utilize that to make better decisions. Yeah.
So let's stay on the issue of the predictive qualities of AI, and kind of let's return to that 2x2 framing and situate ourselves squarely in long term, right? And I'm going to ask you guys to make some kind of bold predictions. When we think about the predictive abilities of AI today and assume that they're going to get more and more sophisticated, if we're looking 5 years out, 7 years out, what might we see?
I think one of the things that we can do with AI, and I think we're making progress towards this, is in terms of player understanding decision making and helping athletes develop and understand their own decision making better, and really gauge, like you take a quarterback, run him through every decision that Tom Brady had to make over the last 3 seasons, and see how they react to them. And then gauge how well they made decisions relative to Tom Brady, and then understand when they're actually playing, where are they making mistakes? How are they, in which way can they focus their training to improve how they are performing on the field? And I think that's one of the really interesting things we can do to actually improve the product on the field that we see.
Yeah, great. Anybody else want to jump in on this?
I think it's close to unanswerable in the sense that it's what makes everyone anxious when they hear about sort of not the things we're talking about today, but the larger kind of general AI, or even you get anxious if you hear about AI in your field, right, where you're thought to be an expert, is much easier to imagine what goes away than what appears, right? So it's much easier to understand which jobs disappear and which skill sets are less and less valued in the marketplace because of these things than it is for us to understand what will appear. I like this author, Kevin Kelly. He talks sometimes about, at the turn of the century, 95% of the country were farmers, right? And if you had gone to all of them and said, in the future, only 2% of you will be farmers, right? Everyone would have had enormous anxiety about what would have happened for them and their families and their children. And they couldn't have imagined like what would have happened. And if you would have told them, it still wouldn't have helped. You'd have said like, your grandchildren will be graphic designers and SEO experts and bloggers and podcasters and the like, right? And analytics experts, right? And basketball, and do all of these things. Like that would have been so hard to imagine for folks at the time. I think it's equally hard for us right now. In the same way that we use, we adopt Google Maps or Waze or something really, really quickly. Right. And if you would have told us 15 years ago that you would no longer have to memorize your way around Boston, that would have seemed really far-fetched.
Yeah, Martin.
So I think where it ends up in business, maybe in sport, I don't know, is decision support. So the fear or the hope of some is that everything becomes automated. We end up with automated decisions. Logically, that cannot happen because, as was commented on this morning, a decision is a better prediction, but it's also a better prediction in the context of your objectives, your values, the context at the time, and then also, of course, changing contextual assumptions. It's, I think it's a very salutary lesson that there's this very simple game called the US election, repeated game with stable rules, with a simple binary outcome, with access to infinite amounts of data, and most forecasters got it wrong. Why? Because the predictive models were based upon assumptions about a voter turnout that had changed. So actually, AI is, to make a slightly simplifying statement, AI is about predictive models. We must match those predictive models with causal models and then put them in the context of our objectives and values. Hence, we, I think, arrive at decision support, not automated decision making.
I think that's a really important point. And my sense is we're all kind of techno-optimists up here on the stage. And largely, I'm going to assume that most of the audience is, or perhaps they wouldn't be here. But I won't make too broad assumptions. But there really are two schools of thought around AI. One is, it really picks up, Sam, what you were talking about, and that is, this is just the next cycle of technology adoption, and economies and jobs adapt along with technologies, and we've seen it repeatedly over and over, right? There was the move from agrarian to industrial. 30 years ago, we were worried about what would happen to all the typists. Where were they going to get work? Well, lo and behold, there was new work. But then there's another school of thought that says, no, this is different, right? Because we are getting into replacing the human mind, and not just kind of the human as a physical form, that there's something more threatening. And I'd be interested in any of your takes on this, Patrick.
Yeah, to start with, I think AI is just going to help us do our jobs better. So if you look at any sporting organisation or what we do at Stats, there are a lot of monotonous tasks. And if you ask anyone, they said, please, we need to automate this, whether it's data collection, cutting tape, we need to automate that. And so that's going to free up people to do things which are challenging. I think in the terms of economy, the way that we value things is going to change, okay? So I think instead of focusing on technology, they're going to be more person-centric things. So the tools that we're trying to develop are just trying to help a domain expert do their job better. And so that allows them to spend more time with their players or their staff, or if you're a teacher, with their students. And so ultimately, we're still humans. People have to execute. So if I know the answer, I still have to be good enough and practice that to do that. So I think there's a limit. I think the way that we value things will change, but ultimately, I think this is going to make our lives easier. There's just a lot of things that we don't want to do. This should be able to automate that.
So as we're, on that theme, let's kind of pivot the conversation to kind of barriers to entry or challenges. Clearly, we're still figuring out what AI can do, but we're sold on its long-term, maybe transformative value. And yet there are a lot of cultural issues that we've got to address as we bring this into the organization. And maybe we could start the conversation by building on what we've already learned about bringing analytics, pretty foreign substance, into sports organizations. Are there things we've learned there that we think we can apply to bringing AI more deeply into the organization? Ben?
Well, sure. I mean, I think that anytime you're introducing new technology, there are going to be people, like us that get really excited about it right away and want to use it, and then there are the traditionalists who don't want it at all, and then there are people who are trying to figure it out. The truth is, and similar to the theme we were talking about just before, is the technology is coming, the technology is here, people are going to get used it, and it can even be used for evil and gloom and doom. Of course, all technologies can. Can it be used to benefit us? Of course, it can. And so it's a question of harnessing it and then getting people inside the organization to buy into it and actually use it. And then, the first sort of, well, it's a black box, I don't understand what's going on, we're not using something like that because nobody can explain how this works. And that's a kind of a fraudulent excuse, right? Because we use things we don't understand all the time. I'm talking about Google Maps. We use weather forecasts. How many people really understand how the weather forecast works? We don't care really whether we understand it. We care whether the outputs sort of make sense to us and we can understand that they help us. And the people that are giving it to us, particularly in a small organization, we actually trust those people. And so all of that has to come together for that technology to innovate within the organization.
So Sam, thinking about the particular culture of a professional sports franchise, what do you see as some of the key hurdles here?
I think one of the lessons is one of the things that the folks organizing this conference are trying to steer it towards talking about, which is the bottleneck often for anything new that stops implementation is your ability to communicate it, right? And what I talk to entrepreneurs about a lot is it's your job to share it in a way that they can consume it, right? So put your big brain on their problem, right? And in a way that you have to build the API directly to them in a way that they can understand it. And for some people, that's how do you pitch it? For some people, that's how do you describe it in a way that they can understand? How do you anchor it to things that they already know, to tools that they already use? And then how do you not hand wave when you don't know, but say it? Say, I don't know. I don't know how that works. I don't know. I don't have much confidence in this. Please don't use it. It's dangerous. Like, this is not worthy of relying on. These other things are. But that variability, I think, is likely to apply here as well, where right now in every sports organization, they have lots of people. If they're not inherently numeric, you still have lots of people that understand many basics that use numbers, right? And the more and more complicated it gets, you get to a smaller part of the funnel of people who understand that. And it's the job of the people, if you really want to be effective, to be able to communicate it to them in a way that they can take it in.
Yeah, this is some advice I give to students all the time, is that you can do the most brilliant, you can solve basketball, but if you can't explain it and get people to use it and get people to trust you enough to rely on it, the work is just wasted. So let's spend some time working on those skills to actually get people to buy into what you're doing.
Just following up on the Ben, it's a limitation of the technology. It's a language thing or an interface thing. The way that we communicate with that technology, words may not be enough. Okay, sport is really complex. Try to, they say a picture tells 1,000 words. I'm not going to type 1,000 words to describe a player. We talk about X's and O's. Why don't we have an interface to actually draw that or have an example and find that? I think that's the key. There's a lot of cool things that you can do, but if you can't query something, if you can't ask it in the right language, then we're not going to progress. So I think that's the big thing. We have to have that right language, that right interface to ask the questions that we want. Because again, sport's really, really complex, so we have to match that.
And that's really important because it's understanding the language of the organization and translating all the technology into that language.
Whose responsibility is that within the organization?
The innovator.
Is it solely the innovator?
I mean, if they're not,
because it has to start with
if they don't take that role on, then it's not going to happen. Hopefully, you get leadership, to push and say yes, you should listen to this. But if the innovator's not doing a good job of it, then it's not going to happen.
So let's assume the innovator isn't one person, but a group of people. Is there a function within that innovation group is there a role within that innovation group that maybe isn't mature yet in organizations? The translator, I don't know what the right word is.
But that's the art of innovation, right? You have to listen to your customers. You have to see the pain point, and then if they have a particular pain point, you listen to it and you innovate with them. I don't think you want to go into an ivory tower and just say, hey, we have this great idea. I think it has to be that interaction.
So I think the forcing function is aggregate effect. I think it's very easy to be seduced by we can do this one thing really well.
Yeah.
Whoops, the people don't understand it. Or I think the forcing function is the aggregate objectives of the organization, because that forces you to then look at things like human interfaces, to the human beings know what's going on. So we did a very interesting experiment in my group. We took a problem. It happened to be, can you predict from the outside the innovativeness of companies? But it doesn't really matter what the problem is. And we actually had we launched a competition of 3 ways of solving the problem. One was with a smart analyst with a pencil and paper. The other one was with the world's leading commercial algorithm for that purpose, and then another one was where the humans that were going to work with the algorithm could design the interface with the algorithm. And the result was that the last one won. It produced the best results. The worst results were actually the best algorithm with no redesigned interface. And the human beings with pencil and paper did fairly well. And it was all to do with the ability to understand and tinker with and triangulate on what the output of the algorithm meant. And that was important because in most situations in business, you're not just concerned with prediction, you're concerned with actually causing change in the world, changing something for the better. So you actually need to understand why things happen and where to intervene. So you need a causal model as well as a predictive model.
And so in that experiment, the human algorithmic interaction produced the best results.
Yes.
Correct? Well, so that's really interesting. Go ahead.
So tinkering was the key concept. If you could say, well, what happens if I do this, if I do that, why did that happen? Let me try it this way. Then A, the humans buy into the algorithm. They feel comfortable with it. B, it's not like pilots that don't fly anymore. Their responsibilities and their capabilities don't atrophy. And then thirdly, they maintain a causal model. Why is this happening, and therefore what do I do? Whereas a beautiful visual interface that simply says, this is the answer, you can go to sleep, in aggregate doesn't have the right effect.
So that's a highly rational way of kind of introducing a new technology into an organization, is to cite a study like that. But I don't think rational gets it done alone. And so, I mean, we've all talked about this, and it's been an important part of our conversation so far, this tension, I think I would call it, between humans and technology as technology becomes more and more human. So I think, do we have to go beyond the rational? I mean, what are the other ways we kind of get people comfortable?
I think we see it every day. If you go to Netflix, we have recommendation, okay? I don't want someone to tell me what to watch, but I want to narrow down that list.
Yeah.
And I think we do it every day. You go to Amazon, they have a recommendation list. I think we're out of the age of information. I heard this really nice quote, we're out of the information age, we're in the age of recommendation. Because there's so much data, we just want to get someone to that area so they can make their own decision. And so maybe that correlates with what you were saying, Martin.
And probably familiarity is important, would you agree? In that, if you haven't done it, you can be very fearful. If you've done it a bit, you can have some concerns. If you've done it 100 times, it just becomes normal. It stops being magic, and you can figure out ways of using it. So I think, there's 85% of companies that expect that they will be advantaged by AI. I think many of them are going to be disappointed because they're not actually doing anything. Yep. It's about a race to familiarity, I think, and experience.
What about thinking about how to take the first step?
Build a scorecard. Say, how well are you doing it now? How well are you doing anything now? I'm like, I don't think it's off topic. I'm like super bullish on like autonomous cars and just what that could mean. We'll see when. Some people think very soon. Some people think further out. I think to really get your head around it, all you have to do is really intuit what it means for how bad a human driver is. How bad we all are, how bad I am, how bad you are, how bad the average is, how bad we are at night when somebody's been drinking, when you're distracted, when you're texting. Like, these are death machines. We drive around everywhere, right? And so the bar is really, really low. And so if you can just, that's the current operation, the current best case. And so now the question is, can you beat it? And if you can beat it by a little, you'd think about it. If you can beat it by a lot, you'd surely do it. If you can beat it exponentially, like you're derelict in your duty if you don't switch, right? And there's all sorts of challenges to that. So often just creating a scorecard of like how things are happening now is a good place to start.
Yeah.
And I think additionally you can start opening people's minds to what the possibilities are. I mean, you think about a general manager, coming up to the trade deadline, thinking about all the potential trades that exist. I mean, you can mechanically create that list of every trade that works. Then right now you could use your fans on Twitter and the trade machine to narrow that list down to some lists. But what if you had an AI that not only could tell you what is possible, what fits into the rules, but what is good for your team and what is likely to get done? So based on all the behavior we have of all the general managers, we have track records, we can look at this stuff. We have, some teams even have more private information logs and of discussions they've had to inform that even more. You're going to have real possibilities to and guide the general manager's time when the time is really compressed to be able to make better decisions and explore more opportunities.
So would that suggest that a smart way to think about bringing in something like AI into your organization is to start in the front office, where the environment is more controlled?
I think it depends on who your front office people, who your coaches is.
Yeah.
I think a smart way to start is find something scarce in your organization that's valuable and make it abundant.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think the danger is that you start safe by pointing the AI at a question that doesn't matter. Right. And then you've got a perfect compromise. It's pigeonholed. So I think point it at something that matters, keep a scorecard, but also I think there's this thing called simulation play. So when we're trying to teach managers new ways of thinking about strategy, we use an AI-based game. And of course, the big advantage is that they can go bankrupt 100 times and it doesn't cost anything, and it only takes a couple of hours. So I think in sports, I'm right in saying that we're close to having simulated environments in many games. That's a way to get familiar. It's a way to learn. It's a way to actually feel out what that human-machine interface is, and it's a pretty good place to start.
Well, we've already had it for 20 years. People play video games. That's AI. The only problem is it's not based on real data. It's deterministic. It's handcrafted rules. I think we have the interface. People play video games. People have that simulation. You should be able to answer those what-if questions because we do that every day. Most people who are in the US know soccer because of FIFA. We have that interaction. We have the template. So people know AI because of sports. We just have to get it realistic. And we're not far away, but I think that's it. That's the template there. And so it's exciting. We should be able to do that. We've seen AR and VR as well. But people do it every day. We just need to make it more realistic.
Is there an actual tipping point? I'm just looking at this long list of fantastic audience questions. And there's a really good question in here. And I'm going to rephrase it, but just because we're talking about it doesn't actually make it real. Is there a tipping point that is going to make AI a pervasive tool in organizations? Have we reached it?
I think in the NBA we're there.
Yeah.
We use tracking data. You look at the NFL, you have Zebra, the RFID. In soccer, we have tracking data. So in a way, we have that data, but it's sensing. We have to make sense of the sensing. So I don't think it's truly pervasive. We have the capability. We need to do better. But a lot of the ingredients are there. But that's from my data-centric viewpoint.
Yeah, I would agree, though. As long as, with deep learning is, on the spatial data in the NBA, it's really hard to compete in the NBA without using that. Yeah. Whether it's player acquisition or game strategy, it gets used every single day. Is that pervasive? It's not, automated decision making, but it's decision support based on really deep analysis.
Martin?
I think the tipping point's already occurred. The technologies are good enough to make better predictions than humans in many cases. The economic incentive is obviously there. The belief is there. There's a lot of providers to choose from now. One of the biggest practical bottlenecks that will determine the speed is actually the data. So one of the first questions that we ask when going to an organization is, what data do you have and do you own it? And now a lot of other previous waves of digital, you asked earlier what is different. What is different this time is you can't call up IBM and say, could I have an AI, please? Because it depends upon the training data and the training process. So do you have the data is a very important question. In some cases, that data doesn't exist or you don't own it. Or the negative data is very important, doesn't exist. You don't collect data on the failures. For instance, I work a lot in the pharmaceutical industry, and we think the pharmaceutical industry invents drugs. Well, it invents drugs with low probabilities. Actually, mostly what it does is fail to develop drugs. And if you don't have the data on the patterns of failure, you can't produce a prediction value. So a lot of it comes back to the data, the speed of progression.
Great. So Sam, here's an audience question that I think has your name written all over it. When do you believe AI will be, when will AI-driven simulation be at a place where players and coaches will buy into it?
I don't know, for sure the answer. I think it's a fool's errand to try to predict. I think if you say 6 months or 6 years, I don't think it really matters. I think at some level, as these things get, it's the scientific method with technology. That hadn't let us down. That's been all right, right? So let's see where it goes. Let's ride that, right? For however far it goes, and maybe it'll make us a ton smarter and end up way short of that, and so you'll never get there, right? Yep. And maybe it will do like it's done in many periods and wildly exceed our expectations in the speed of how fast it happens. I don't really know. I think staying on the path and riding the wave is critical because it opens up these other possibilities of things that just didn't seem possible before, because what's novel today is a building block for what you can build tomorrow. Right. And it even opens up your own eyes to what you can layer on top of that. Oh, if I can remix this and that, I never knew if you would have told Red Auerbach that we could have spatial tracking data of players and track every player of every game around the world every night and measure how well these players impact the defensive game, I think people would have adapted to that very quickly. There would have been high burden of proof to actually utilize it, but I think people would have adapted it very quickly.
Fair enough. Patrick, there's a question in here that is really asking, how will kind of AI-driven AI technologies, and particularly, I think, spatial camera, other kind of visual interpretive abilities that are coming out of AI, are they going to drive us to new stats? Can we imagine new stats? I mean, of course, analytics has introduced an entire new lexicon of statistics. Do we expect that? Might we expect that from AI as well?
Yes and no. If you look at deep learning, there's simulation. So when we simulate, fine-grained player trajectories, that's a prediction. So what is a metric? Metric is just aggregate. So it's just a coarse descriptor of what happens. I think what we're going to see in the future is the ability just to capture more data and the ability to reconstruct. And I think these metrics, I think we're going to have the ability just to drill down to specific contexts. And we're never going to have enough data. I don't care what you think. Because if you drill down to the specific context, you go 3 or 4 layers down, there's just too many permutations. And this is where something called generative adversarial networks, or GANs, or these generative models, the ability to synthesize new data. You have to have enough to synthesize new data, and that allows you to predict certain things in certain situations. So Sam was talking about AlphaGo before, backstage, but that's how that stuff works, deep reinforcement learning. The ability to synthesize new examples which can generalize to things you haven't seen. So that's where I think the sweet spot is, the ability to generate new data, because we're never going to have enough data.
To tie their last 2 points together, I think that's critical. I think the most interesting places in this are technologies in which you can create new data, right? Because at some level, if you're using TensorFlow or open source algorithms that everyone else is using, you have to outrun the bear, right? So you have to run faster than everyone else. That's challenging in an open source way. And B, if you're dealing with the same data, good luck, right? You need data that other people aren't dealing with, right? And so at some level, once you've bought up all the data from all the vendors you can buy, at some level, the onus is on you to create more data, right? And to create more data out of things in the past or simulations or whatever you're using, and to be able to fold those in a recursive way back into your models. Now you have something proprietary. Before that, you had very little, and anyone else could reasonably expect to catch up with you in a short period of time.
Right, and so that kind of great unknown is the most exciting thing about all of this. I mean, I'm interested in, again, I'm putting you all on the spot by asking you to talk about specific technologies, so, but I get to do that. What about emotion sensing technologies? Will we be able to measure Peyton Manning face, credit Bill Simmons?
I mean, I don't see why not. As technology, facial recognition, understanding behavior and patterns of movement and things, we should be able to sense all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so my previous life, that's exactly what we did. When I worked at Disney, we had a project where we watched people watch movies based on their facial expressions.
That's why everybody's so happy at Disneyland, by the way.
Sorry, what's that?
That's why everybody's so happy at Disneyland.
Well, it's the happiest place in the world, isn't it? Yeah, so based on facial expressions and body motion, you can detect those things. And we can do better than humans. And again, it's kind of the predictive markets gambling. It's not what people are doing, it's if they're doing something exactly at the same time. And so I think you can actually capture that. I think you can do those things. Yeah, it's all about context, so I suppose.
Martin, what are you seeing on these technologies?
So on the theme of generative data and new applications, so we're seeing that one of the problems is workforce planning, which is if AI changes the game, what skills will I need? And you can use loose analogies between job categories and imagine what jobs you might need. It turns out to be not very good in my domain, strategy. So we're actually using this game I referred to earlier, this business strategy game, based on AI, to actually generate gameplay data, to generate strategic personality types, which are like cognitive biases, different styles of learning, that actually tell you, they don't tell you perfectly, but they tell you better than any signal we currently have, who's probably going to do well in what situations. So interestingly, we end up learning, what we learn about the game players from the generative data turns out to be one of the biggest values. So we're currently working with a a neuroscience startup that came out of MIT called Pymetrics to build a link between neuroscience capabilities, strategic capabilities, and gameplay driven by AI, and that's the generative application here.
Oh, nice. So we're getting big red type on the iPad that says we have to wrap up. I am sorry that there's a list, it's this huge list of fantastic questions. Panelists, I would dart out of the room really quick, otherwise you're going to get trapped. But thank you all very much. I think this was a terrific conversation.